In our previous set of lessons, we talked about the French Revolution. Do you still remember what we discussed? We tried to understand the various events that led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. We also analyzed the estate system that was prevalent in the pre-revolution French society. People of the third estate, the bourgeois, the peasants were being exploited by the first and the second estates, which is why they broke out in rebellion. And thus followed the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, the Bastille prison was overthrown. The French monarch King Louis XVI was decapitated. Following this came the Reign of Terror, and after the end of the Reign of Terror was established the First Republic of France. Now, what was happening in France after the French Republic was established? Let us now time travel back to the post-revolution France. Before we begin to discuss the social cultural landscape that was prevalent in France after the French Revolution, let me ask you a question. Do you know who this man is? And how significant he is in the pages of history? Yes, you are right. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. After the French Revolution, it was Napoleon who came to power in France, and soon he became the master of not just France but of the entire Europe. Now, to understand this event in history, we have to trace the background that led to Napoleon's rise to power. Our story begins in the small island of Corsica, where on August 15, 1769, Napoleon took birth. He then moved to Paris and he joined a military school. Soon after he graduated, and right after that he joined the French army. Napoleon wanted to rise up the military ranks, but the higher ranks were reserved only for nobility. This angered Napoleon. He wanted to overthrow these estate systems, which is why he was inspired by the French Revolution. What happened after it? Liberty, equality and fraternity. These ideas inspired Napoleon. Soon after, he joined the cause of the revolutionaries, and then he rose to the rank of a general, which is the highest rank in French army. In 1793, a moment of fame came for Napoleon. Britain had invaded the port city of Toulon, which is a major port city in the south of France. Napoleon, along with his troops, marched to Toulon and defeated the British troops here. This meant a huge victory for Napoleon. On account of this victory, he could now rise up the military ranks and become the general of the French army. The Republican government, or the Directory as it was called, was a brainchild of the French Revolution. What did we see before the French Revolution? Before the French Revolution, the royalty, the clergy that together comprised the first and the second estates were exploiting the third estate. Now, after the French Revolution took place, a republican government was set up. Now, when this republican government was being established, the people of France had high hopes from this government. They thought that this one government will be able to provide them responses, to provide them solutions to all the political turmoils, to the turbulent phase that they have been going through during the revolution. The Republican government could do something initially, but afterwards it failed to do anything constructive. Why is it so? This is because in our previous lesson we have learned how the Republican government was also divided by certain factions. Factions as in the radicals and the royalists. While on the one hand, the royalists were in support of the monarchy, that is, they wanted to have the French monarchy in place, the radicals were extreme left. They wanted to counter and overthrow the monarchy. And it is this conflict between them, it is this rife between them that shook the Republican government. Along with this, the French Revolution also costed them huge resources. Because to sustain a war, to provide resources to the troops, huge amounts of money was required. Simultaneously, France was also embroiled in wars with other European powers. As a result of this turbulent situation, the Republican government was now declining in power. And what are the reasons behind this? Political instability, economic crisis, and excessive warfare. So, the Republican government failed to restore calm and political stability in the country, which is why people were starting to lose faith in this one Republican government. They realized that this government cannot provide them with answers, with solutions to all the problems, to all the crises that they were facing. It is because of this reason that during this period after the French Revolution, military generals were gaining importance. They were gaining more prominence over politicians. While we are talking about the fact that France was involved in excessive warfare with other European powers, we should also remember that France was slowly becoming a militaristic nation. That means that the military power of France was gaining importance. It is for this reason that military generals were now rising to prominence and politicians were losing their power, their prominence. This was slowly paving the way for the absolute dissolution of the Republican government. But do you think this happened overnight? That is, somehow the people of France woke up one morning and found the Republican government was replaced with something? Let us find out how this process took place. That is, the process by which the Republican government was dissolved. The questions we just raised bring us to a very important discussion. It is that military generals were now gaining prominence. They were now rising to power. After leading very successful campaigns in Syria and Egypt, Napoleon had come back to France, and in this way he could ward off major European powers and stop them from attacking France. When he did this, the people of France, who were living through a phase of turbulence and turmoil, politically and economically speaking, they realized that Napoleon could be their leader. He could be a leader of their nation, which is why Napoleon was now revered as a hero. The military successes that he had achieved in not just Syria and Egypt but also in other expeditions brought him fame. People now started revering him as a hero. In fact, in the image here, you can see how the masses are now cheering Napoleon as their hero. The stage on which he is standing shows you that he had already assumed power. He was now the general of the French army, which is the highest position in this military rank. Now the people of France had also begun loving him. They had put their faith in Napoleon as their hero, which is why he was gaining huge influence and importance in the French society. But through this point, what do I want to establish? The fact that Napoleon was revered as a hero, what does this mean? Now, when Napoleon was slowly gaining power, something else was also happening. Few members of the Directory or the Republican government were trying to overthrow the government itself. In this way, they were trying to assume power. they realized along with the people of France that this Republican government was very inefficient. It was incompetent when it came to giving the people of France political stability, a sense of calm. Now, many members of the Directory wanted to overthrow the inefficient Republican government of France. Now, you must be wondering who these members were. One such member was Emmanuel Joseph Size. This person also wanted to overthrow the inefficient Republican government and come to power. But simultaneously he realized that the people of France will not let him be in power for long, which is why he thought of an idea. What was that idea? He saw how Napoleon was gaining popularity among the masses, how Napoleon was being loved and respected by the people of France. So he thought that if he can join hands with Napoleon, who would overthrow the Republican government, then they can form their own power structure. In this way, he proposed this idea to Napoleon. A very ambitious leader as he was, Napoleon did not think twice before implementing this idea. Now, in what way did Napoleon come to power officially? What was the process in which he overthrew the inefficient Republican government? Let us now discuss that. This brings us to the Bloodless Scope. What was the Bloodless Scope? To understand the Bloodless Scope, let me give you a little backstory. Emmanuel Size himself was a member of the Directory. As a member of the Directory, he recommended that the Directory meets at a palace in Paris on 8th of November 1799. Simultaneously, he informed the Directory that troops were trying to invade and defeat this assembly. Now, while he was the one who thought of this strategy, who thought of this plan to overthrow the Republican government, he simultaneously informed the government about this. Now, when the government or when the Directory met at that palace in Paris, to their surprise, that entire palace was surrounded by the troops of Napoleon. They were very surprised and befuddled. How did Napoleon suddenly surround their palace? So, Napoleon asked them to surrender. The Directory initially refused to surrender, but after a point the Directory realized that it did not have any other option. So, on the 8th of November 1799, the Directory officially surrendered and gave up all its power. Now, who came to power? It was Napoleon. So, with this Bloodless Scope of 8th November 1799, power was transferred from the Directory to Napoleon and his troops. Now, you must be wondering why this is called the Bloodless Scope. This is because this transfer or this shift of power happened without any bloodshed and violence. Napoleon did not attack the Directory. The Directory instead willingly surrendered all its power. And so happened this Bloodless Scope of 8th November 1799. On account of this Bloodless Scope, a change of power and government now came in France. So, with this, the former Republican government of France was dissolved. Now, which government came to power after this Republican government was dissolved? What happened and what system of governance followed this period? Let us find this out. Before proceeding with this lesson and understanding what happened after the Bloodless Scope, let me ask you a question. In which year did the Bloodless Scope take place? Was it in 1796, 1797, 1798 or 1799? Yes, you are right. The Bloodless Scope took place in the November of 1799, and with this bloodless coup came to an end the Republican government, and something else was put up in its place. Let us now find out what that something was. The bloodless coup of 1799 officially marks Napoleon's rise to power. This is because Napoleon was gaining prominence and popularity among the masses by virtue of his military success. But when this bloodless coup took place, power was no longer in the hands of the Directory. Power instead came into the hands of the consulate. So, it was Napoleon under whose leadership this Directory gave way to consulate. Now, what was the consulate? How was this consulate structured? This is what we will be coming to now. With the bloodless coup, the Republican government was put to sleep. The Republican government had its own constitution for France, and after the bloodless coup, that constitution also became obsolete. Now the consulate set up its own government and had its own constitution. What was the structure of this consulate? This consulate government comprised 3 consuls. Who were these 3 consuls? These are names that you are already familiar with. The first consul was Napoleon Bonaparte, under whose leadership this consulate was formed. The second consul was Emmanuel Size. Emmanuel Size was the person who proposed this idea of overthrowing the Republican government. So, he became the second consul. And another member of the Directory became the third consul. Now, the Republican government was very democratic and liberal in nature, because it was the government of the people of France. People from all the sections of the society together made up that Republican government. As opposed to the Republican government that was democratic in nature, this consulate government was oligarchic in nature. What does that mean? That means that power was concentrated in the hands of few people. And these 3 consuls constituted those few people. Power over the nation of France, power over the people of France was constituted in the hands of these 3 consuls. Opposed to the previous government, this government was oligarchic in nature. Now, how did people live under this government? And how much power did these consuls get to yield on the people of France? The points we have been discussing all this while inform us that Napoleon was very ambitious. He was a person who wanted to rise up the social ladder. He wanted to gain power and wield that power over people. Which is why he made that consulate government centered on himself alone. He became the first consul of the consulate government, and the other 2 consuls were also changed. Now it was his say that ruled the consulate government. So, in the truest sense of the term, this consulate government was now a military dictatorship under Napoleon. It was Napoleon's say that was final. He made all major decisions. The other 2 consuls were there, but it was Napoleon who sat himself at the helm, at the apex. He had the final power in this consulate government. Now, while we come to an end of our discussion on Napoleon's rise to power, let us quickly try to trace the trajectory through which Napoleon came to power. At the age of 7, he joined a military school, and soon after he graduated from that military school at the age of 16, he joined the French army. Very ambitious and determined and powerful as he was, Napoleon soon started rising up the military ranks. So, in the year 1795, he became the general of the French army. After leading many successful military campaigns, now in the year 1795, Napoleon rose to the rank of the general of the French army. It was the highest rank in the French army. But Napoleon wasn't a person who wanted to be restricted to that one position of the general of the French army. He wanted to yield power. He wanted power at his disposal, which is why in the year 1799, under his leadership took place the Bloodless Scope. Through this Bloodless Scope, now power over the people of France came directly in the hands of the consulate government, and it was Napoleon who became the first consul. So all the power was now at his disposal. Meant for bigger things, for huge victories, Napoleon wanted to take steps ahead. What did he do after this? In the year 1802, he became a consul for life. So, in 1799, he became the first consul, and in 1802, he became a consul for life, which means that he will be a part of that consulate government throughout his life. Though this means that he was at the apex of the consulate government, he wanted to take another major leap. What did he do after becoming the first consul and a consul for life? In the year 1804, Napoleon now became the Emperor of France. So, he started as a general in 1795, and within a span of very few years, in 1804, he became the Emperor of France. Now, certain questions must be coming to your mind, I'm sure about that. One would be that Napoleon himself was inspired by the French Revolution. The French Revolution intended to overthrow monarchical rule. Now, a person who was himself inspired by the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, how did this same person crown himself the Emperor of France? This might sound very contradictory to you. Now, it is this discussion along with Napoleon's policies and how he ruled the people of France, how the people of France responded to his rule, that we will be taking up in our subsequent lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million-plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.